Millions of Americans are facing eviction. We already had a housing crisis across the country, especially in big cities who have had rising housing costs due to massive development and tax incentives. But now that is exacerbated isn't even the right word. Whatever exacerbated times 10 is what Americans are facing right now. And we won't even know how serious this is probably for several months once it really starts to stick into the economy. So there are tenants groups across the country that are organizing to get stronger tenants laws, to get stronger housing laws, and in New York State, just a year and a half ago, we had some of the weakest tenants laws in the country. But due to great organizing by activists, New Yorkers were able to defeat there was a group of members of the Senate called the IDC. You may recall I've covered them before. They were holding up quite a few laws in New York preventing progress, preventing protections. But part of that was because real estate had essentially bought off these 8 senators caucusing with Republicans, the real estate industry, which is a very powerful force in New York State and city. Luckily, the IDC was defeated, and the Senate is now controlled by the Democrats again. And in the last year, we were able to have some housing laws passed. Of course, there's always more room to grow. And of course, we're seeing why that's important right now. Jonathan Hirschman is one of the organizers out of the Clinton Hill group, the Taaffee Tenant Association. And he's here to tell us a little bit about the work that they're doing in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn, which, of course, is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, okay, did this tenants association exist prior to COVID-19?
It kind of started to form slightly before, but COVID really accelerated the effort and caused people to come together pretty quickly.
It's interesting because there's been a lot of organizing, as you know, because you're a New Yorker. There's been quite a bit of organizing on the ground around protecting tenants and taking on big real estate. I mean, my campaign personally was a big part of that. In that the real estate industry, the developers in particular, have been able to basically, my words, buy off our politicians, supposed progressive politicians here in New York City. And the consequences, as we're seeing right now, are incredibly severe. So are you seeing a shift in local political response, given the fact that these tenants organizing groups are popping up around the city?
Well, our attitude, and I think our observation, is that no help is coming from the government, and that it's up for neighbors to help neighbors in solidarity. And so we focus particularly on that. We have in the past tenants in the buildings that we represent have tried a political solution in the past with limited success. So at this point, we're taking it into our own hands.
So what does that mean? How do you take it to your own hands? What can neighbors do for each other?
So the first thing I'll just mention is, and I'm sure you're aware about how in New York City, no one knows the people that live in their buildings. So the first thing was really, and I have to say I can't take credit for this, we had some amazing people that got this ball rolling, to build trust between neighbors. And the next step was to educate, get volunteers, learn about the situation. We're making this up a lot as we go along, and ultimately it culminated in 60 households in our association paying to retain an attorney to defend the most vulnerable and to take other actions. And again, we're just, we're doing it ourselves. People that are very distressed are still coming up with $50 a month to donate towards retained counsel.
So as of right now, there is a moratorium on evictions in New York City and New York State. Every state, let me just be very clear, every state has its own set of laws. So if you don't live in New York, I just want to be very clear, make sure to do as much research as possible about your community and your states and your city's laws, because they're not always the same. But in New York City, we have an eviction moratorium for tenants. I think it's just been expanded to September. Is that correct?
It's till September 4th. It does not apply to many distressed renters.
Why is that?
If you, again, my understanding may be incomplete, so anyone should check my homework. But if you had a situation with a landlord prior to March 7th, you may not be getting this protection. And there may be other carve-outs that I'm not aware of. It's kind of just strong enough to kick the can, down the road, and that's about it.
Okay, so just to be clear, prior to March 7th, meaning like COVID-19 related rentals. So, yeah. So, okay, so you're going door to door, and how are the tenants in these buildings responding? And do they understand what's going on? And like, how many do you feel are really affected by this?
It's interesting you say that. One of the things that I've observed is that the business model of landlords is individualized and weak and uninformed tenants. It's literally their business model. And if tenants are continuing to be that way, they're effectively helping the landlord against their own best interests. What we found is that a lot of people are just in denial about the severity of the situation. They think that the economy is going to come back any minute. They think that the vaccine is coming next week. And people that still have a job, and our unemployment in our neighborhood is around 25%. They think that it's never going to touch them. They don't understand that the landlord has already taken actions against their best interests, even if they're up to date on their rent and everything else. So it's really difficult to get through apathy and to some degree some willful ignorance. But once people you start to break through, and we've had pretty good success in doing it, they become incredibly engaged. And we have amazing people in our association. And I'm privileged to have been able to meet all of them and to break that New York cycle of not knowing your neighbor. So that's been the silver lining, actually.
It's interesting. It's always communities that come together. So as you're doing this work, I can imagine that you've been doing this for the last few months. How many doors have you knocked on in which there was a tenant there the previous month and now there's not? They're moving.
It's hard to say. The landlord actually plays a shell game to make it look like there's less vacancy than there is. We're guessing that the vacancy that the landlord has across five buildings, around 350 units, is between 10 and 20%, which matches up with city averages. They're helped a little bit because we're near local colleges, so there's a lot of transient students that are getting some bargains right now. But yeah, I mean, what's I think more interesting is not necessarily the people that are moving out, but what people are doing to cope with the situation. So a next door neighbor of mine, instead of moving out because he couldn't make rent, brought in a whole bunch of sheetrock, made a lot more bedrooms, and just crowded more roommates in that would each pay less in order to make rent, which is, really underscores the fact that bad housing policy is bad public health policy.
Absolutely. And meaning because there's more people in one home. When the virus spread in New York, they realized very quickly that people who have more residents in a household, families, et cetera, roommates, it was spreading at a more rapid rate.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. So, you're organizing, you're educating folks. How are you specifically fighting back? What are some of the policies that you're trying to get passed or changed so that renters are protected right now?
Well, we have a few different goals. The first thing is I should mention our landlord, Alma Realty. We initially attempted to engage with them without attorneys, just to have a discussion. And they refused to do that. They would not speak to us in any kind of collective situation. What we've asked Alma for is an understanding that there should be, it comes down to some shared pain. It seems very inequitable that the landlord gets their margin and that, the residents are almost 100% have a substantial loss of income due to this situation. The landlord doesn't understand that the market that existed before people signed their last lease no longer exists. And that I think there's a reasonable discussion. We're not looking for free rent. We're just looking for a little bit of help and a little bit of understanding and to keep people in their homes.
What's so interesting about that, I mean, that's exactly the point, is this isn't the economy that existed prior to COVID-19, which, let's be clear, was quite a bit of a landlord's market. I mean, there was a decade of growth in this city, really 2 decades since 9/11, but the last decade, the city has grown so fast. Rents have become increasing rapidly out of control in terms of prices. There's been little to no rent control up until a year ago, barely any. And of course, wages have stayed pretty low. And so it's really pushed people out of out of their communities, and communities have changed very fast, which is always very good for landlords, very good for developers to come in and build high rises in communities that, they probably would have seen as, quote, untouchable, 5 years prior. And it's not only that, they've designed this. They have like economic models that build into forecast, 10, 15 years from now. So I'm wondering, like, if they're just not, from a tactical perspective, they're just not really putting their thinking caps on and thinking like this community is going to change.
Well,
is it quarterly to quarterly? Like, I'm trying to think, like, what are they, if everyone leaves, you don't have a building. If 40% of New Yorkers move out, your business model doesn't work either. Wouldn't you want to help them so that a few months from now, hopefully, they'll be able to afford rent again, even if it's less than it was before?
Well, interesting. There are dynamics that may not be obvious. What we found is that the situation with landlords and our landlord is a lot like corporate America in general. A lot like the sins of corporate America. So one example of that is that our landlord for the buildings in our association is highly leveraged. The business model isn't as much in collecting rent as it is in every few years getting a larger and larger mortgage and sweeping that extra money into their coffers. So at this point, before the pandemic, we estimated that about somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the gross rents were going to service their debt. And so, yeah, when you get into now this is a back of the envelope calculation, and it may be somewhat inaccurate, but it's a pretty substantial amount of the gross goes to pay the debt. So when suddenly you have high vacancy rates, and the trends that had powered, New York City for so many years have just completely reversed. They may no longer have the ability to do anything about it. They may have no choice. I mean, there's no sympathy here, but they may have painted themselves into a corner, much the way that the airlines, used their money to do stock buybacks and then didn't have any reserves to do anything in a downturn. We're seeing that situation play out, in a microcosm with our landlord. That's not the renter's problem. But if the landlord is not conducting its business appropriately, but that may be one explanation for their stubborn refusal to accept reality. They may not have a choice.
Thanks for watching and listening to the Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.